Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this latest RootWorks webinar, What Happened with Cannabis in the Election? My name is Ben Hartman. I'm the content manager here at RootWorks, and I'll be your host for this webinar. So last week on Election Day, quite a few things happened in all different types of ways, but particularly specifically in cannabis. We saw some big initiatives dealing with legalization in places like Florida and the Dakotas, Nebraska, elsewhere. And some of the bigger ones didn't do perhaps as well as some people in the industry may have predicted. So we're going to look at that today, look at what happened last week in cannabis, and then kind of moving forward, what we think about what it means for cannabis reform and even maybe what we can expect from the next 4 years in that regard. So to help us kind of make sense of all that, we have an expert here with us today, Andrew Livingston. He's the Director of Economics and Research at the cannabis law firm Vicente LLP's Denver office, where he helps clients develop and expand their enterprises across cannabis markets in the States and internationally. Hi, Andrew. Thanks for being here today.
Hey, Ben. Great to be back. And really, I was happy to chat about election outcomes, data analysis, what this means for the growth of markets, and all of that jazz.
Yeah, definitely. And if you've seen any Andrew's been on air with us before and always has some really good insights. So definitely happy to have you. I guess, so most people, I think, in the cannabis industry are probably familiar with what Florida's Amendment 3 was all about. But for those who maybe don't, I guess, give a quick overview of what that ballot initiative would have done, and then kind of, I guess, some of the other big issues we have there.
Yeah. So we had Amendment 3 in Florida. That was full legalization. The text was somewhat limited, and that is in large part because of previous rulings by the state Supreme Court regarding single subject rules, as well as the limited content of the summaries that needs to be posted. So it essentially just amended the existing medical cannabis amendment to allow those licensed under the medical cannabis regime to sell adult use cannabis, and then basically directed the legislature that they can license additional entities to sell adult use cannabis. There had been previous issues where they couldn't, force the legislature to act, and putting forward a fully comprehensive, new regulatory system was attempted in kind of previous iterations to try to get on the ballot in Florida and had been knocked down. So this got the furthest adult use has gotten in Florida, which is actually onto the ballot, approved to, collect signatures, and then, enough signatures to get on the ballot, and then, to the election. But Florida requires that you have a 60% threshold to pass this legislation through the ballot. And so it failed with about, I think it's like 56, 57% of the vote. That initiative to get, the requirement to get 60% has been in place in Florida for almost 18 years. It actually passed in 2006. So it just means that it's really hard to get anything passed in Florida. It was not just cannabis, but abortion rights also failed in Florida this year. So Florida was the biggest one. Obviously, that's a multi-billion-dollar medical cannabis market would be a significantly multi-billion-dollar adult use market. Likely could be honestly one of the biggest adult use markets in the country. If it was able to implement itself more effectively than California, for instance, which only has about $4 or $5 billion in sales. So that failed. That was a real bummer. North and South Dakota also both failed. They had, tried previously in other years and have had a string of failures. I'm happy to chat about why I think that is. Both North and South Dakota are becoming more and more conservative. We did see Nebraska successfully pass medical cannabis with an overwhelming majority. But it's yet to be seen whether or not that will actually become law, as there's some ongoing litigation regarding signature collection in Nebraska, and just really some process issues there that are being, in my mind, overly litigated by the state. One of the things we've seen really across the country is that Republican-held legislatures and governors are doing, and really the Republican legal apparatus is doing all they can to not just make ballot access more difficult. So, for instance, like South Dakota passed the single subject rule in 2019, and that's what doomed the adult use measure that actually was approved by voters in 2020. So, they're making it harder and harder to get these measures onto the ballot and then pass, increasing the threshold rate. When we passed cannabis legalization in Colorado in 2012, we only needed 50%, but now you need 55% to amend the Colorado Constitution. So it's becoming more and more difficult. And then beyond that, there's also a lot of lawfare, litigation about process issues. So
it seems like 60%, hard to get 60% of people for anything.
You can get it for medical cannabis.
Medically,
yeah, sure. Which has like 80 some odd percent of the support, according to Pew. But adult use, depending on where you're at, there are some adult use measures that have passed with more than 60%. I think New Jersey, when they did it, passed with more than 60%. But Florida is it's not a purple state even; it's a red state. And so even though Trump came out in favor of it, DeSantis used a lot of state money, in many ways likely misappropriated state money, to put out political ads against cannabis and abortion. Whether that has any repercussions, probably not, because he controls the state and is overwhelmingly popular in the state. So we'll see what happens with that. And it wasn't even just things that didn't pass on election day. Arkansas tried to get a measure before voters that would have expanded its medical cannabis regime. Litigation and lawsuits stymied that. So at the state level, when it comes to ballot measures, there are only a handful of new additional states to move forward. I did see that there were some activists pushing in Idaho in 2026. That's medical cannabis. I think it would be fine. I could just look up for a second what that actually
would be tough for recreational.
Is it?
Well, what would it have meant for I guess for the industry as a whole? I mean, Florida is such a giant state and it's such a kind of bellwether state for so many things. Let's say they had approved recreational cannabis. Would that have been sort of, I mean, I wouldn't say a tipping point or something, but I mean, what would that have meant overall for the cause?
I mean, I think that we're already beyond the tipping point, right? Like, Ohio has legalization. Legalization is overwhelmingly popular in the United States. It's not going anywhere. We say it lost in Florida, but it lost with like a 10-point swing, right? Like in a year in which Republicans did better pretty much everywhere, both in red states and blue states. So, it would have been another sign that cannabis is an overwhelmingly bipartisan issue. But there was opposition from both the left and the right. There's opposition from those who wanted a more expansive program or a more expansive initiative because maybe they didn't understand how the state of Florida had restricted more expansive more expansive adult use legalization measures previously. There was also opposition from the right, from those who didn't want cannabis legalization because of what it meant for cultural or public health, or DeSantis just complained about the smell of cannabis. It's fine.
Well, have you noticed that? I guess it's hard to quantify, but does it seem that maybe people have somewhat not soured on it, but maybe, I don't know, just anecdotally in recent months, you see more and more headlines about the hidden, risks of cannabis. There was a big New York Times article a few weeks back, and there just seems to be more skepticism about it out there, at least in the media, maybe.
I really don't think so. If you look at the Gallup poll, it's been roughly at in the 60%. Let me just get the pull up the exact thing. I ran it a little bit yesterday. Right. So this.
It's definitely popular. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, so it there was some Gallup polls that, some people are thinking the harms of cannabis are slightly higher than they were. So like, there was an interesting, Gallup analysis from over the summer, that said that like, okay, does cannabis have a somewhat negative, or very negative effect on society? And it did. Essentially, the negative increase between 2022 and 2024 from 50% to 54%. And it also increased for people who had a negative view on its impact on consumers, on the people who use it, from 22 to 24%. But when we look at the the question of what does this mean for actual support for legalization, let me just wait for this to load. That's stayed at roughly 68% since 2020. It did, increase to 70% in 2023, but I don't know what the statistical norm is. So, the question is okay, has the support for legalization declined? No. Has the support for legalization not continued to increase at the pace that it did, for instance, between 2014 and 2020? During that period of time in 2014, cannabis legalization was at 51% approval. By 2020, it was at 68. So that was an increase in a span of essentially 6 years of 9%. Since in the last 6 years, cannabis has only increased 2%, and it's really kind of flatlined. So is it a problem to flatline at 68%? Not really, unless you're dealing with passing in states that require, a super majority to legalize. It's also, 68% across the total population. Are we seeing flatlining amongst support for Republicans? Maybe that's the case. But I think in large part that will depend upon what cultural issues the Trump administration focuses on over the next 4 years. Because I think those cultural issues will become the overwhelming focus amongst Republicans.
Do you think it's, or maybe it's also the 68% among people who actually go out and vote? I mean, that's the overall.
Yeah,
population.
I have to look at whether or not Gallup is looking at just likely voters, or whether or not it's all individual surveys. I don't think it's just likely voters. So, but I mean, if we look at how cannabis initiatives fare, it really depends state by state, right? Like, yes, they failed in North and South Dakota, but North and South Dakota have gotten more conservative since over the last decade plus. So I just as in preparation for this, I looked at both North and South Dakota and the percentage that a Republican has gotten since 2008. So every single year, both North and South Dakota have gotten progressively more Republican as the percentage. So John McCain won North Dakota, 53.3%. John McCain won South Dakota with 53.2%. And in 2024, so what is that?
Just 16 years.
2024. So what is that? 16 years later.
Yeah.
16 years later, Trump wins South Dakota by 63.4%. So more than 10 percentage points higher than when Obama first won. And North Dakota, Trump won by an even higher margin at 67.5%. Wow. So are these states getting more and more conservative? Yeah, I mean it's pretty clearly the case. And what does that mean for cannabis? So I think the larger question with all of this is, does cannabis get lumped in with democratic cultural issues, and as such creates a reflexive opposition from Republicans and social conservatives?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it different? Is it kind of its own unique issue because Trump isn't necessarily opposed to it? And while there's opposition amongst the cultural right, both the new cultural right and the existing, more traditional evangelical right, what does that mean in terms of your base voter?
Yeah. Would you consider it still, or if we did before, like a bipartisan thing, cannabis legalization, or is it not? It's not.
I think among voters, it's bipartisan.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are, you can call it bipartisan because there's a handful of Republican elected officials that will vote for legalization. But it's not overwhelmingly bipartisan, right? Like, bipartisan issues can pass in a split Congress. I mean, cannabis can.
Right.
It's hard because an issue can both be bipartisan, but if it's so high profile,
mm-hmm.
it's also hard to pass.
Right. Well, let's say, I guess maybe it depends on also where the opposition. In other words, like if law enforcement is opposed, and then law enforcement is, culturally conservative, or conservatives are pro law enforcement, and there's a red wave of sorts on election day, it would make sense that, by extension, then those things would fail, right? I mean, is it?
I think it's not necessarily like in favor of law enforcement. It's whether or not this was an a order and disorder election, right? So I think definitely the last two presidential elections have been order and disorder elections.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2020, obviously there was a lot of crazy disorder with regards to Trump's handling of COVID, with COVID generally, with the lockdowns, chaos over the summer with, racial unrest and, the George Floyd protests. And people didn't see Trump at that time as being the candidate of order. They saw him as disorganized and disorder. And they, elected Joe Biden at the time because they saw him as returning to normalcy and as a kind of just get back to normal, orderly person. Mm-hmm. Now, over the last 4 years, with inflation quite high, so, an economic instability and economic disorder, as well as increases in the number of migrants coming into the United States under asylum laws, there was again a big pushback on order and disorder. I think whenever you have a focus on how do we get our country back into order, cannabis is always going to struggle.
Because it's seen as a sort of a more...
And that is because cannabis is seen as something that is not, it's not furthering order. It's, it's the sort of thing that I think that maybe some voters say that, like, when times are good, we can add something that's a little more libertine and is advancing individual liberty, even if that liberty comes with some disorder.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I've been trying to contextualize the loss in 2024. Now, what's odd, though, is that, like, South Dakota passed adult use legalization along with medical in 2020, right? And I just said that was an order versus disorder election.
Right.
It could be that, there was enough people that were in support of medical cannabis, which was also on the ballot there, that maybe there was some voter confusion and people thought everything was medical cannabis. Although medical cannabis did get a much higher percentage than that one did. So could have also just been the times, right? Mm-hmm. Like, who was motivated to vote? How were people feeling at that time? It's not like, Trump did better in South Dakota in 2020 than he did in 2016, but still adult use passed. So there's obviously shifts. It's hard to know exactly, why,
Yeah,
but that being said, so Trump did better in South Dakota in 2020 versus 2016, but it's pretty much identical. He got 61.5% in 2016 and 61.8% in 2020. So,
it's not night and day there over there.
No, it's not night and day at all.
Do you think it's that cannabis is still, or it could be seen as something that moves the needle at all for politicians? Like I remember, Kamala came out and she had a really big, it was her platform that she was putting out, the criminal justice reform one she put out a couple weeks before the election, and cannabis legalization was up at the top. And, but I mean, I just don't, it's not maybe a big enough thing to move the needle, or is it just not something that really?
I wish it was. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wish it was something that moved the needle. But it's not really something that we're seeing substantially bring voters out.
Yeah, or like a cool added bonus to voters, like, hey, they're also going to legalize, but it's not something. It's not like the economy or immigration or abortion. It's not one of these, really, hardcore central issues. But I wonder if politicians still see it as something like, maybe in a close election, I come out in favor of legalization, that'll bump me up even just 1% or something, or if it's just not.
I mean, there's a lot of things on the margin. So one of these, I've been watching a lot of postmortems and analysis of the election. And one of the things, the theory of politics that I think is shown not to be correct is the Democrats focus on essentially policies for specific people. So it's like we're losing, support from, from working class union members. Let's create policies that help to support them. Or, losing support from young men. Let's try to, create policies that are going to be helping working class white men. Or losing support amongst, Black Americans. Let's try to do a policy that's going to benefit them. And that makes sense if you view the world from a technocratic perspective in which voters are voting directly based upon policy ideals that quantifiably will have a beneficial impact on their lives. I just don't think that's the case, right? And I think it's not to say that it's like, some people on the progressive left will say, like, I don't understand why all these poor, white people in the center of the country are voting against their own interest.
Right.
And times people say, like, oh, well, they're voting against their own interest. They're voting against their own interest. And it's like, you do realize that, like, highly educated suburban and, white individuals with high incomes would also, by your same rationale, be voting against their own interest. But you never say that amongst your own voters because you understand that people don't put, their tax bracket and the, distribution of government benefits as their highest issue. They put, what they see as vision, leadership, cultural, social. Does the country reflect my vision of America? And so we need to understand, I mean, particularly as it comes to cannabis too, it's like, how do we include cannabis legalization within the vision of America, both on the left and the right? And how do we communicate this reality in a way that it's like, this is a benefit that regardless of what side you're on order or disorder, on cultural issues or economic issues, that this is something you should support. And I think the best way to do that is through telling stories. I mean, one of the times at which we saw the cannabis legalization and support for cannabis do the best, it's kind of two periods. One, it was the focus on medical cannabis for pediatric epilepsy, and essentially the way that cannabis could be used to treat, little children who were suffering from, severe illnesses. That humanized cannabis, and particularly humanized medical cannabis, in a way that was very helpful and was also very different from the way that medical cannabis was viewed before then, which is just, a joke that people in California say they have a backache so they can get high.
Yeah.
Right?
Or it was only, I guess, in another cultural way, it was so identified with AIDS patients and the Bay Area. And that was easy to kind of, I think, for a lot of people to be dismissive of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's like dying AIDS patients are very sympathetic amongst the left, but there's probably a subsegment on the right who thinks, well, that's their own fault. So they're not as sympathetic as, a 2-year-old with epilepsy. And then the other way that cannabis really surged in support was when we saw the first adult use laws being implemented successfully in tax revenue. And that was a story that these states can pass these laws, and yes, there will be hiccups, but they can create a functioning, successful market that creates regulated products with, yes, some hiccups and some negative stories, but overwhelmingly good. And, cannabis legalization is, more popular in Colorado now than it was when it passed originally. Right. But most states aren't as good at implementing cannabis as Colorado is. I mean, California didn't do nearly as well.
I was going to say, is it maybe that in the years since people have seen, I don't know about failed, but have seen how it hasn't been seamless, let's say, in every state? That's
I think so. And I think that the focus of cannabis legalization and implementation on the more technocratic aspects of who receives licenses has increased the complexity of cannabis implementation and also increased the negative stories around that, such that has maybe soured people not against legalization itself, but has soured people about whether or not this can be done in a way that meets the expressed goals of the broader population. So the broader population, I think, when this sort of situation looks at it and says, I want a legal and regulated cannabis market that provides quality products and the black market is reduced. But if you look at what's happened in New York City, yes, they're getting better at putting forward stores. The black market expanded in some ways, and not necessarily expanded. The black market got more visible. Yeah. And there was not necessarily, this wasn't necessarily seen as a law that furthered order. In some ways, it was seen as furthering disorder, because now you have a combination of illicit markets that is harder to enforce against others. And I think part of the reason was because the state had the admirable position to try to, put its thumb on the licensing process and structure in a way that helped disadvantage entrepreneurs, which is something we should absolutely try to do. But it makes it more complicated. It opens up all these programs to a lot more litigation. That litigation slows down implementation and can have the effect of demonstrating to people, both on the left and right and center, that maybe this isn't being implemented as well, right? It's like, and we can't just say it's like, well, New York is a blue state, people are always going to be supportive of legalization, right? Like New York had a huge swing to the right in this recent election, throughout New York City. And it's not just, oh, well, it's now more white people are coming out. No, it's like a multicultural shift to the right. And we can't basically have a system where we say, this isn't implemented well, this isn't going to work, so we can't legalize because we can't trust the government. There's this all-time low trust in institutions, and it takes a lot of trust in institutions to legalize and regulate a product. I think when I was talking to my brother in Boston and trying to analyze what happened in psychedelics in Massachusetts, which also failed by a large margin. it could be that, and we need to see some exit polling, so this is just conjecture at this point, but it could be that maybe some of the news out of Oregon of difficulties with implementation led people to believe this is going to be overly complicated, and I just don't know if it's going to be able to be regulated effectively. And so it may further disorder rather than, an orderly market.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really important for us to consider, right? It's like, cannabis, first became legal for medical use in California in 1996. And yes, there was kind of a steady increase in cannabis support from that period of time throughout the next decade. But the way that California was not able to regulate its medical laws in the ways that Colorado was in 2010 did make it harder to pass medical cannabis regimes in kind of that decade from about 2005 to about 2015.
Mm-hmm.
All of those unregulated shops that were popping up in areas of California made it, more difficult to pass these laws. And the laws that did pass, the subsequent laws that did pass on the East Coast in the 2010s were very restrictive or, highly focused on security and big businesses.
Yeah.
This is why New York, New Jersey, and others under the medical cannabis regime had a limited number of licenses that were predominantly controlled by wealthy white investors that were focused on security and business acumen.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, right, like there's all butterfly effects. So I'm going to string some things together that I think may or may not be true or not, but this is just my conjecture.
Okay.
California was unable to regulate its medical cannabis regime in 2010, even earlier, wasn't able to pass the same sort of laws at the state level that Colorado did in 2010 to make its patient caregiver unregulated storefronts that were popping up legal.
Mm-hmm.
It took all the way until 2015 to do that. In that intervening time, medical cannabis laws that passed on the East Coast were overly focused on restrictions, limited number of licenses, ensuring that the businesses, vertical integration, ensuring that the businesses that did appear were highly regulated, focused on security, and well capitalized. Those then became owned and controlled predominantly by wealthy white individuals. Mm-hmm. The fact that then those East Coast markets, medical cannabis markets, were dominated by wealthy white individuals and created a system in which when adult use legalization happened in those markets 10 years later, that there was a focus on social equity and not just creating a market that transitioned those existing operators to adult use in a way that advantaged them, like Colorado did back in 2012. So that focus on licensing to kind of correct the overcorrection previously resulted in a system of licensing delays, litigation, and lack of trust in democratic, and I mean big D, so democratic politics,
right?
Ability to implement cannabis laws.
Yeah, I think it's where it's been chaotic. It makes sense that it would.
Yeah,
not chaotic.
So I think there's been this back and forth, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, what happens if a state doesn't regulate well? Well, sometimes that forces other states to overregulate, which is not in line with the cultural feelings at the time, which then causes someone to go in the opposite direction. So we see this shifting back and forth amongst the history of cannabis regulatory systems. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some of that. Like, now, what does this mean for the next 4 years, right? That was a lot of conjecture on history, which I think is interesting, but maybe for a longer podcast. What this means for the next 4 years? Well, most of the action is going to continue at the state level, right? Whether or not Trump or Kamala Harris became president, I don't think there would have been a ton of action in Congress, just because it's hard to get anything passed in Congress. So, are we going to see banking reform? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. It seems like Republicans now have full control of the House and the Senate.
Mhm.
I don't think we're going to see banking reform in the next 2 years. Maybe if they're split, we'll see. Do Republicans want to take this issue away from Democrats? Maybe.
Is there a big dividend there? Do they see it as something that it's like a big win for them, or is it just sort of?
I don't really know. I think a lot of this depends on like what is in the initial drafts,
Mm.
and if we aren't seeing this in the initial drafts, legislation. I mean, there's also like there are a lot of Republicans that are opposed. So, I don't think they're going to add it in. We'll see. Maybe we could get it tacked into the what is it, TTRJ, the Tax Cuts Reforms and Jobs Act, the extenuation of the Trump tax cuts. We'll see. There'll be a lot of lobbying to try to do that.
Mm.
But most of the action is going to continue being at the state level. Now, sadly, that doesn't mean implementing new state laws, but it does mean implementing existing state laws, right? So it's like the next 2 to 4 years, what happens in New York, what happens in New Jersey, what happens in Maryland, what happens in Ohio, what happens even in California, where they've had a medical cannabis regime for almost a decade, but hasn't necessarily been implemented as effectively as it could be. Is the real question. What happens in Missouri? There are a lot of cannabis states that have room to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the market, with that room to grow in these individual states, has a lot of place to expand,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the Florida legalization would have increased the total, adult use market sales, nationally by a few billion. But the few billion in sales would have predominantly benefited a few existing companies there.
Right.
Now
Put up the money for the campaign, which I mean that was
what happens in
$150 million. I was gonna say the ones who put the $150 million up for the campaign, which is
and I will say that it's like sure it would benefit them, but the same thing happened in in Missouri or Ohio or others where it's like the people that are putting up the money are putting forward an initiative and they're going to be the first ones to transition. Florida, because of the way, as I mentioned earlier, because of the way that this state has made it really hard to get ballot initiatives approved, I do not fault TrueLeave or the existing operators for the way the language was. If you want to get angry that the language in Amendment 3 that failed was not expansive enough, focus your anger at like the Republican Attorney General and Secretaries of State, not at TrueLeave.
Yeah.
Because no one else in the country has put more money in support of cannabis legalization than TrueLeave.
Yeah,
Based on
$150 million, right?
That is more money than every other. So I have to double check this, but I'm almost sure it's true.
More than all
That is more money than every other legalization campaign combined.
Wow.
Right? California was like 26 million in favor of legalization.
Wow. It's a much bigger state.
I'm pretty sure it's more money than everyone else combined.
It makes sense. Like, I mean, it's a massive amount of money. It was a 150 million.
Huge campaign. So we should give them our support and thanks for putting up that much money because it wouldn't have gotten as close as it did. There wasn't that much support. There wasn't that much financial support.
What do you think will happen with Schedule 3 in the next 4 years? I mean, is that maybe change the calculus a little bit for people? Like, we already have some reform in the works. This is not a maybe it's taking the wind lesson.
I mean, the real question is like that train has left the station, right? It's very much on the tracks, but doesn't mean that it's going to automatically get to Schedule 3.
Yeah.
Right. There are ways that it could deviate. So the focus in my mind is, what the cannabis, industry should be focusing all of its attention on and lobbying for the Trump administration is we want to ensure that whoever is coming in head of in charge of the DEA is not going to stymie Schedule 3. We want Schedule 3 to happen and just keep the status quo in terms of federal enforcement, which was the case under Trump's first administration. And Trump has said that he's in favor of Schedule 3. And, if we pitch it as like, this is just for tax breaks. This is tax breaks for cannabis business operators and their wealthy investors. There are more than a few Republican wealthy investors who have an interest in cannabis, and they would all benefit from Schedule 3. So,
focus on getting that one down the road seems like a smart way.
And once that's done, if Trump is the one to usher in Schedule 3, he'll get a lot of cannabis donations, because the cannabis industry is not, dominated by Democrats, right? Like, there's the political affiliation of cannabis entrepreneurs. Do they lean more left than right? I don't really know.
It's hard to say. I mean, it's
hard
to,
Part of me thinks yes, but also business owners tend to lean more right. So I think it probably depends upon the state. Yeah,
I think people maybe like they would look at it culturally. Maybe it seems more left, but then, I mean, that's one thing. But even then, that's a kind of a generalization that I don't know if it really holds up.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, like part of me, if I were to make a guess, I would say like, did the CEOs of the cannabis businesses in Florida, did a majority of them vote Republican or Democrat? So probably a majority of them vote for Republicans.
If I had to,
if I was to take a guess, I don't know. We can't really know that. I mean, I could look up all of the CEOs and their political donations, but I'm not going to do that on the show right now.
Well, you got about 10 minutes if you could. No. Well, I guess before we get out of here, I mean, it's hard to predict too much, but if you were to say, let's say over the Trump administration or the next few years, what do you think will be the next big legalization move, the next state maybe to flip over? Is there one that seems the most likely?
I mean, I think the most likely next state is probably Hawaii. It's one of the only states with a Democratic trifecta that doesn't have adult use legalization. It's got to go through the legislature. I think that's very possible. Probably more likely than not. I don't think necessarily Pennsylvania is going to switch, right? We have not seen any state legislature with a, split or Republican held, state house and state Senate pass legalization. The only adult use legalization law that's been passed without a Democratic trifecta was Vermont, and that's because the Republican governor there is not a right-leaning conservative, and also he let it go into effect without his vote. So I think we should, if we want to look at like what is the most likely in terms of state legislative states, it's places with Democratic trifecta, and that has Oregon is the only one, not Oregon, and Hawaii is the only one left there. Then I think it's about expansion, right? Like, sometimes you're in a cycle where you're looking to buy a new house. Other times you're in a cycle where you're looking to do home renovations. Next 4 years is going to be, essentially home renovations. It's how can we improve the operations of cannabis markets? How can we, like what's going to happen with hemp, right? Like, what's going to happen with the 2020, I guess, 5 Farm Bill? I don't know what year it's going to be called, Farm Bill. What's going to happen with hemp there? Is hemp in favor, or, is it going to get pushed away to the side? There are Republicans on kind of both sides of that. How do we integrate that in with adult use in the states where, they're clashing? I think those are really kind of going to be the important questions in the cannabis markets over the next 4 years. And of course, the first and foremost is what happens with free scheduling, right? Because, that's going to affect everyone's bottom line. And not just the direct cannabis companies, but also their investors and also the ancillary companies around them that only survive as long as cannabis companies are profitable.
Well, it's only been a week since, one of the bigger elections of my lifetime, and more, I guess, it could be one of the more significant ones that we've lived through. And so it's going to be hard to say. A lot of these postmortems, I mean, we've had a ton and it's only been a week. So we're going to know a lot more moving forward.
Yeah.
If we all have to move to Hawaii, like you suggested, that's I guess something we could consider. But it'll be interesting. I think I guess we'll just keep following it. And in 2 years, there could be more ballot initiatives in the midterms. I guess that we don't even know what changes are coming potentially. But
yeah, I don't know what's going to be put forward in 2026. I see Idaho is looking to try to get. If it's adult use legalization, it's going to be real hard to pass adult use legalization in Idaho in an off year. Don't think that's a great idea. But
start with medical.
Start with medical. Yeah.
And it's a big agricultural state. Maybe there could be a way to, look at the economic aspects of it.
Here's the thing: you can pass medical cannabis, do it the way Nebraska did. No defined qualifying conditions, so physicians can recommend for anything they wish, and no restrictions on product types. It's fine, totally good.
Yeah, why not? I mean, seems like a rare state to me.
Yeah, and it's not like, it's like, well, you pass adult use legalization for like the tourist data. For the tourist demand. Like,
in
there's
Nebraska,
not much border. You pass adult, like what's the difference between expansive medical and adult use, right? Let's look at like Florida, for instance, right? You've got like 8% of the population is patients. There's, hundreds of stores across the state. It's not that hard to get a medical cannabis. What is the advantage there? Well, it's tourists. It's people who are unwilling to get a medical card.
Snowboarders.
But people unwilling to get a medical card is less so now. There used to be. But it's really predominantly for, tourism, right?
Yeah. Massive.
That's really important in Florida. It's like much less so important in Idaho. Granted, I have been a tourist in Idaho. It's an awesome place to go whitewater rafting.
It's very pretty.
It's very pretty. But really, it's like, how can we take advantage of, right now, the Boise market is going into Oregon.
Wow. That's a long drive.
So it's like, I would recommend starting out with medical. Obviously, it's up to activists there to do with what they want. I will support them. I will, probably, if they ask, I'd do a pro bono economic and market analysis for them. But I think it's probably going to be hard to pass anything through the ballot box in very Republican states until 2028.
Well, we're going to keep our eyes on it, and it's always going to be interesting. And hopefully, at the very least, Schedule 3. Well, Andrew, thanks so much for being with us here today. Again, you always have a whole lot of insights and help make sense of all this stuff. If you want to learn more about or see more about what Andrew does and what's going on at Vicente, check out Vicente LLP. And then here at RootWorks, see our solutions for the cannabis industry, for training, safety training, compliance, and everything. And join us for the next webinar. Thanks for tuning in, definitely. Even no matter what happened in your state in Election Day. So thanks, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Always a good time.